I would like to introduce Dr. Jo May, who is the Honorary Associate Professor, Pathways and Academic Learning at the University of Newcastle. Jo is fairly widely published in the history of Australian education. She has a special interest in biography, gender, visual representations, and oral history. Now, most of you will have read the half page on the October newsletter, which gave you a full bio of Jo and also a full abstract of tonight's talk. So I would like to introduce Jo and thank her very much for coming along to talk to us tonight. Her talk is based on the memories of 40 students who attended Newcastle Girls High School and Newcastle Boys High School from the 1930s to the 1950s. And I'll invite Jo to come up.
Good evening, everyone, and it's just lovely to be speaking to you in this very special building with all its very special resources, this lovely historic setting. And it's great to be talking to people who are interested in history, not general in the public, but here I know we're among the cognizant. Before I begin, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians, the Wabakol and the Warramai people, where I live in very much closer to the river, on the land we love and the land which they cared for millennia before us. I also support the Uluru Statement from the Heart. So, by way of introduction, I want to say a few general observations about schools and about teachers. Now, schools can be understood as locations that create the conditions of relations of power. That is, they are hierarchical. And in this top-down structure, the most powerful group are the teachers. Teachers control the knowledge students learn, and they organise the learning experiences. They command both the space within the school and the time within the school day. They set the tone of the school, creating its culture as an organisation. This is particularly poignant in the case of oral histories, because in oral histories of schooling, teachers figure prominently. My presentation tonight, as you've heard, concerns the oral histories of 40 volunteers, 24 women and 16 men, who attended Newcastle Girls High and Newcastle Boys High from the 1930s to the 1950s. And I was only thinking today, actually, something happens in the 1950s and we really need a study that looks at memories from the 1950s on, because I think there's a big shift that happens in memory. However, I'll talk about that later if you wish. Now, I did a tri-level analysis of the oral histories. That is, first of all, I looked at content, the content level. And then I looked at, sort of put a lens over the material that was a gendered lens. So I was looking at, well, what did the men remember? What did the women remember? So I was looking at a gendered lens, through a gendered lens. And then finally at the mythological level. Now, in this case, myths are not lies. We think of myths as, oh, that's a myth. But a myth is not a lie. It's an inflection of the truth. And myths are shaping stories. And they are held across groups. So I was looking at what stories are held, or narrative lines are held across the groups of men and women, and of the whole group, the 40. So they're like choral notes, where the interviewees seem to sing together, and they have, that is, tell the same story. What is interesting is that despite the disparity of their birth dates, and some were born very early in the piece of the century, most were born, however, in the 1920s and the 1930s. So There were a couple of outliers, some were later and some, but most were born in those 2 decades. The informant's memories, however, are remarkably consistent across this time frame. Perhaps this is because as large formal institutions, schools are resistant to change. From the time of their establishment, Newcastle Girls' High and Newcastle Boys' High actively developed and appropriated from other elite schools and sought to maintain school cultures through traditions. Traditions like school songs, insignia, mottos, uniforms, all the trappings of elite schooling were also invigorated in the state system. So, yes, thank you. Further continuity was enhanced by many of the teachers who, once the appointments were made to these prestigious schools, and they were prestigious schools, spent many years as staff members and often not retired from the school. So they stayed a long time, and that assists in the kind of continuity. All right, so this is what you're in for. First, I'll look at the establishment of secondary education in Newcastle, and especially Newcastle Girls' High and Newcastle Boys' High. Then teachers in general, and what makes a good teacher and what makes a bad teacher. Then I'm going to look at this choral notes of how the women sang together in what I'm calling a narrative of the secular nun. And then I'm going to look at the men teachers and how the men remembered their teachers as worldly, as of the world. And finally, my conclusions. So, we'll go to the next slide. Thank you. When the first 8 state selective high schools, 4 for girls, 4 for boys, were established in 1883 and 1884 in New South Wales, Newcastle was not included in the list of cities, the 4 cities that would have schools. It was bypassed for the larger centre at the time of Maitland. And so Maitland got 2 schools, Maitland Girls' High and Maitland Boys' High. And that opened in 1884. So it took until 1906 for a high school to be established in Newcastle. And it was established, it was known as the Hill School, it was established in 3 rooms at Newcastle Public School, the old Hill School. Having opened with a total of 28 pupils in 1906, and it reached 95 by the end of that year, it had 165 students by 1911, 286 students by 1912, and 559 by 1929. So there was a great need in the city for a school that would educate what you might call an aristocracy of talent. That was the way the department thought of it, out of the community, and especially to make teachers. The high schools were very intimately acquainted with the making of teachers. So this increase in enrolment occurred as Newcastle itself was transformed from a coal mining town into a city centred on heavy industry. The population of the city and its environs almost doubled from just over 55,000 to almost 104,000 between 1911 and 1941. As the population of the city and its schools grew, the demands became more urgent to have a separate girls and a separate boys' high school established in the city. In 1930, after years of local agitation, 2 selective single-sex high schools, Newcastle Girls' High and Newcastle Boys' High, were created out of the old co-educational Newcastle High School. From 1930 then, educational space for selected secondary students in the city was primarily structured by sex and gender. Burns and Goodnow have said that one of the major features of Australian education generally was, quote, an unabashed enthusiasm for the segregation of the sexes. The larger primary schools, for example, were usually divided into girls' and boys' departments. How many people here were in a girls' playground and a boys' playground? Take you back. But you should go to the bits where the boys were around. So playgrounds were segregated. The Newcastle Girls' Home was built on land, as you all know, in Parkway Avenue, acquired for the purpose in 1913. The school building has 1928 emblazoned on it, but that was when the foundation stone was laid by Minister Drummond. The building was completed on July 29, 1929 at a cost of £36,395. Now, I went to the Reserve Bank's inflation calculator on Google, and it tells me that this is roughly equivalent today to $3.2 million. It had 17 classrooms and other specialist areas, as well as an assembly hall for 545 people, a library and a gymnasium. The entrance contained, in the architect's words, an imposing portico with balcony above, presumably for principals to come out from home. In August 1929, the school was occupied by 3 junior classes attached to Cooksville Intermediate High, and Miss Ralston was in charge. And we don't know why that brief occupation happened. The actual opening of the school was in February 1930. And it began with an enrolment of 505 girls. So there were a lot of parents very keen to get their girls into a school in the future. Okay, and the next slide. Moving on to Newcastle Boys High, it was first established in the old high school when the girls left. So they were left behind in buildings that were widely considered to be unsanitary, unhealthy, inadequate, old, not fit for purpose. They stayed there for a long, long time. In fact, one headmaster, Harvey, who left to go to another school, said that he'll never in his lifetime see a separate school for the boys somewhere, a new school. He had given up, even though he had fought very hard to get a separate school and a new school. So in 1929, the total enrolment of Newcastle High School boys was 565 students. They were crammed into buildings designed for 300 students. In 1933, enrolments had risen to 640. Now, this was interesting because during the Depression, parents knew that if their boys left, they wouldn't get jobs. So they encouraged them, forced them, maybe, to stay on at school. So the school populations did swell during the Depression, high school populations. And the local community continued to press the government for a new boys' school on land next to the girls' school. Local opinion favoured the site next to the girls' school. But the department was worried. If we put the boys near the girls, what could happen? All kind of horror could break forth. So Minister Drummond, who was quite a straight-laced chap, but quite far-thinking, decided that it would go to Waratah. The new boys' high school would go to Waratah, far enough away not to have too much trouble. Although back corners weren't envisaged, I think. That's where the two riches came. The decision to place the boys' school in the less central suburb of Waratah appears to have arisen from Minister Drummond's personal qualms about having the boys so close to the girls. The minister withstood considerable pressure in his determination to put the boys' school at Waratah. The new Newcastle Boys High School at Waratah opened its doors in 1934. Like the girls' school, the school accepted students with intelligence quotients ranging from 100 to 135 plus. So it was select. The building cost £21,410, which is 1.9 million, considerably less than the girls' school. It was red brick, the girls' school was lovely stone, it had less features to it, nothing emblazoned over the door and no balcony for waving. Just a very red brick Newcastle solid building. Anyway, it had all the accoutrements that you needed. It had main classrooms, it had library offices and hat rooms. And the assembly hall was attached by a covered walkway. Next slide. From their opening in 1930 until their closure and transformation into comprehensive co-educational schools in the 1970s, the Wyndham report came along and Wyndham favoured comprehensive high schools, co-educational schools. a lot of the more weighty groups in Sydney managed to keep selective high schools, but that's another story. Newcastle Boys High and Newcastle Girls High, once established, dominated secondary education in Newcastle for the period that they operated. It is still a matter of some pride to have attended these schools. The fact that they were generally staffed by the most senior and talented teachers in the service helped to enhance the high school standing. From the 1930s until the 1950s, wasn't still in keeping with the standard expected for secondary teachers in New South Wales, members of the staff of these two schools held at least one bachelor degree. A very few had master's degrees, and a couple of the men at the boys' schools had double degrees. The sizes of the two staffs didn't change much throughout the period. In 1949, the staff at the girls' school had grown to 35, 29 with bachelor degrees, and the boys' school had 39 teachers, 33 with bachelor degrees, 2 with masters and 1 with a double degree. Although the scuttlebutt was that the women teachers were better educated than the men teachers. That's just saying. The 35 member staff at the girls' school were almost exclusively female. They were mainly unmarried. The marriage bar for women became law in New South Wales in 1932, with the Married Women Lecturers and Teachers Act number 28. Now, prior to that, it had been a kind of unwritten law that if you got married, you should leave. But it became formalised in the Act in 1932. After this time, married women teachers who married or who were married in general received a month's notice of termination of their employment from the New South Wales Teaching Service. The staff at the boys' school, usually numbering 39, were almost exclusively male up until the 1940s when a female music teacher was hired. Music being a feminine pursuit, you understand. They were mostly married. As will be shown, the status of their teachers as unmarried had a profound impact on the women's memories that I interviewed about their secondary school life, while in the men's memories, the subject of their teachers' marital status hardly arose. Next, please. On to the teachers. What is a good teacher and what is a bad teacher according to my informants? The teachers were identified in the informants' memories with 2 main functions: the imparting of knowledge and the control of the room in which the knowledge was imparted. Students understood that control and learning in the classroom were intimately linked. Good teachers knew and cared about their subjects and/or could control the class. Bad teachers could not control their classes or employed needless violence to do so or did not care about their subject. Furthermore, the informants judged teachers on their learning outcomes, especially in exams. Good teachers got what? Good results. That's right. Next slide, please. Grace remembered her mathematics teacher as the epitome of an efficient, effective machine. An effective, efficient machine. I don't think 80s or 90% were unusual in her results. For Keith, a good teacher, such as his physics teacher, was very structured, very able to get his net. Further, good teachers didn't have to be liked, so long as they taught their subjects well. Gordon, who's pictured here, this is Gordon, running with his class. Gordon remembered that one of his teachers had a violent temper, but his class all received A passes in the intermediate certificate. His use of the word obviously in the following, in the quote there, indicates the normative nature of his understanding. He was a good teacher, obviously. He raved and shouted in general. I think he was a good teacher. He certainly knew what he was talking about. We were all scared of him because he'd do his block. He'd go red in the face and get upset. He wasn't a terribly big man, but he was a good scholar. Next slide, please. As well as being scholars, good teachers had control of their classes. It's mostly achieved through provoking fear in their students. James said that we all did very well at science because we were petrified. Brian explained how his Latin teacher approached lessons. He would frighten you. He was good. I mean, you know. Richard said that his French teacher was a natural born teacher. He was a very strict disciplinarian and was able to keep you disciplined by keeping you interested. So there was no need for him to bully you. And I don't remember there was any noisy carrying on in his classes. Memories about whether a teacher was good or bad could change with the teller. At the girls' high school, this was particularly noticeable regarding one science teacher. And could they make some people who know this teacher? Rose, pictured here, she's up in the second row back from my right. Rose had particular memories, find my place, of how the fear this strict teacher inspired. She said, we could all hear her footsteps coming down the corridor. We'd all be sitting up straight, waiting for her, and we had to rule our margins straight, or we'd be in serious trouble. She got a lot of girls through at science because we were frightened of her. Very strict tone, no smiling. Well, Meg remembered this woman as the most wonderful teacher in the school. She didn't think that she and her classmates were motivated by fear, but by love. So Meg said all her girls worked for her because they loved her and they wouldn't want her to get anything wrong. And she was a harsh taskmaster who really had to be in there. We felt we were doing this because we didn't want to disappoint her, not because we were driven or afraid of her. She was wonderful at getting you to work for her. I mean, the machinations of a teacher. Wonderful at getting you to work for her. Slide 10, please. The men especially remembered bad teachers. Bill had a Latin teacher who was violent. He would hit children around their ears, despite departmental regulations about hitting students on their heads because it was forbidden. You couldn't flick people around the ears or hit them on the head. Too bad, said the teachers in Newcastle Boys' Home. Anyway, it was alleged that this teacher was an alcoholic and that he was a legend of the school. I was glad to see the back of him because he used to belt our ears so much. We feared him. He had no patience with us. He believed in walloping us for unreasonable things. That was the style of teaching. I can't remember that we learned much with him. Colin had one teacher who was a bit vicious and didn't have the ability to put it over. A few teachers at both schools were not so much bad as hopeless. Keith remembered one teacher. Oh, he was hopeless. No, that's not right. He wasn't a bad teacher. He couldn't control the class. He was not strong on discipline at all. He had no control at all, nothing wrong with his knowledge or his expertise. He just couldn't get it across. He just couldn't hold your interest because he had no force and no presentation. And it is interesting that the inspectors used to use the word virile to describe the male teachers, whether they lacked virility or had virility. Very interesting. The women teachers were not subject to virility.
Maybe.
Well, maybe. Yeah. Anyway, with both groups understood that teachers were the prime agents of school discipline. In general, it was the men who tended to remember this aspect of their teacher's role more than the women. One reason for this could be that girls were not allowed to be hit after the age of 12. Prior to that, we could hit them, but up until the age of 12, we hated girls. Most of the men recall being hit by their teachers, thus because the memories of discipline were actually inscribed on their bodies. You remember if you get hit on your body. They didn't used to put you down in words, Reg commented. They used to give you the cane. And Richard recalled, I was quite a good boy. I didn't get into terrible trouble, but a couple of times and again, I can't remember what I did, but I know I was summoned up before Norman, and that's Norman Nuns, principal of Newcastle Boys High School, and given a touch of the cane in order to keep me in order. A touch of the cane. And of course, a lot of the teachers carried and used canes. Some carried them and didn't use them. Some carried them and did use them. Could we go to the next slide? Yeah, I'm behind. That's the quote from Richard. Next slide, please. Don said that in his era, school was harsh and severe, although it didn't seem so at the time. He said there was fear, always fear, and quite a bit of cruelty. That did not include the cane. He remembered teachers pinching, throwing wooden dusters at boys. Yes, I know. It's terrible. Throwing dusters at boys and hitting boys on their heads with bunches of peas, rolled up magazines, and one teacher liked to flick the ruler at the boys on their behinds. Finally, Cyril's comment underscored the relationship between discipline and manliness. He said, I think it helps make a man of you. Right, next slide, please. None of the women recalled physical violence from their teachers. The girls' school, in contradistinction to the boys, emerges from their memories as a quiet and controlled environment. Jane did not recall any discipline problems when she was at Newcastle Girls' High. She said, I mean, you hardly need the teacher to look at you sideways. Rose remembered that the whole school was very quiet. We didn't have any leeway, no freedom of speech as much. You had to toe the line and you had to wear what they told you. She remembered a lot of sarcasm at the school. Most of the women said that they were hardly ever punished. While most recalled being obedient, however, they believed the teachers were strict. Gladys thought that the teachers were very strict. Discipline was the word, said Thelma. And Louise recalled there was regimentation, very strict, bells rang and we changed classes. Girls were, in fact, encouraged to develop an internal locus of control rather than to be externally controlled by an outside force. This is very interesting if you're thinking about the socialisation of males and females. So, girls are expected to have this develop an internal locus of control. They weren't always successful, of course, but you know, we tried. They were more likely to be controlled by strategies that included shaming and sarcasm, rather than fear of physical punishments. British anthropologist Anne Oakley has observed that girls are not controlled through the flesh, but through intangible and metaphorical roots to the soul. Wish I'd written that. Psychological exposure replaced the physical pain of pain. The women teachers. The anomaly of the powerful woman teacher. Three main aspects arose from the women's comments about their teachers: their remoteness, their spinsterhood and presumed celibacy, and their vocation as teachers. Next slide, please. Teachers were seen as distant, devoted, and dedicated. They provoked both reverence and fear in their students. These concepts taken together shape the narrative figure of the secular nun. Next slide, please. The theme of the teacher's remoteness was strong in the women's oral histories. For example, Margaret said, you didn't have any close relationship with them. They were the teacher and you were the student. There was definitely a separation. Olga said, the relationship wasn't close. It was a hierarchical thing. Thelma said, all these teachers, I wouldn't say they were outgoing. They tended to go straight to the teacher's room for morning tea and you didn't bother them. You might go to the playground duty teacher, but everything else was routine. Teachers walked in with the bell when the bell went, started teaching and ended when the bell went. Nancy said they didn't seem as if they got attached to anyone. Didn't have favourites or anything like that. None at all that I can recall. We had what we called a class teacher, and she would come at 3:20 to mark the roll, and that was all she did. You didn't talk to her at all. Gladys thought the teachers were remote. They weren't chummy. They were there to teach you, and that's what they did. Esme's description of the teaching staff as iron grey. Esme was educated in the earlier period of Newcastle Girls. Iron grey epitomises their coldness. The hierarchy of teachers over students was enforced through strict adherence to routine and a culture of dispassionate efficiency among the teachers. Another aspect of the interpersonal distance between teachers and students at the girls' school was the respect many of the women had for their teachers. So there were words like, Ray said, I held them on a pedestal. I looked up to my teachers. They were clearly seen as above, positioned above, pedestals above, looked up to, in awe of them. Students knew little about their teachers as people. Elaine said that she only knew one teacher's first name because she signed her name in full on her report. Ray recalled that she didn't know anything personal about the teachers. I don't remember them telling us anything about themselves. They were all spinsters. The other side of this remoteness was revealed when a teacher allowed the students to get close. And one teacher is remembered as allowing the students to get close. She would actually talk to them as if they were people. And she said it was so unusual, it was kind of, mind-blowing that you could have kind of relationship with a teacher. Otherwise, you didn't have contact with them, she said. Aside from the remoteness of the teachers, the other two dominant aspects, the next one, the other two dominant aspects of the women's memories of the teachers were their spinsterhood and their dedication to the job of teaching. Those two things were intertwined. The fact that the teachers were unmarried had a direct relationship to their professions. Presumably, single teachers were judged to be free to fully commit to the job of teaching. Didn't have any pesky husbands or to worry. Presumably, single women were judged to be free to be committed fully or married to their work. They had no distractions. Because of the marriage bar, single women teachers were regarded as careerists and professionals. In Australia, while outside the school system, spinsterhood was indeed a matter of derision, powerlessness, and suspicion. If you got too old or you're ugly or something, you're a spinster. What do spinsters do? I don't know. Help married women. Okay, so inside the selected girls' high school, and within the students' memories, because that's what I'm interested in, spinsterhood augmented rather than detracted from the power and professional status of these women and their ability to be dedicated in the service of their students. The fact that the single women presided over the school environment in powerful roles added to their distinctiveness of attending a selective girls' high in this period, the 1930s to the 1950s. Some examples from the interviews demonstrate how spinsterhood and devotion to the work were intertwined. And there are a couple up there. And look at the words that are used. I remember all those teachers had a vocation. They were not just there earning their living. Most of them were single, so vocation and single kind of go together. And most of them were career teachers. Louise said we had wonderful teachers. They were dedicated spinsters. We did not have a single married woman. I actually think she's a bit wrong there for her time, but still, I think there was one or two. We had all these spinsters. Some of them were dried up wizard spinsters. Some were gorgeous. Some of them were a bit dotty, but they were all good. Gladys said we had all lady teachers and they were fantastic. They were dedicated. I think we only had 2 married women on the staff, mostly spinster ladies, but that was their whole life. And teaching was their life. Well, it really came through that they really cared about the kids. The teachers at the girls' school, as they are described here, were conceptualised, I think, within the life narrative of the nun. They're not nuns, they're not in a religious school, but they are like nuns. They're secular nuns. Nuns were the only analogous group of public, remote and powerful women who sacrificed the usual female fate of marriage and who were presumably celibate to devote their lives to the higher calling of teaching. In Australia, Catholic convents staffed by women religious, whose devotion to their task was the epitome of the unselfish feminine ideals, provided the most widespread and accessible network of post-elementary schooling for girls in New South Wales at any time in the 19th century. And, of course, for much of the early 20th century. Dominican nuns had run schools in Newcastle from 1867, and the Sisters of Mercy had established a select school for young ladies in inner suburban Newcastle in 1890. Nuns were the obvious touchstone for comprehension of the social anomaly that was the powerful, secular, spinster female teacher. And that's the kind of the mythological level. That's why I think they sang together about these dedicated women, spinster women. Next slide, please. And the repetition of the religious metaphors and vocabulary are once again taken up by the students themselves in their own Ten Commandments, which was published in the school magazine in 1934. The school uniform is a habit, so you have to wear your habit in a manner becoming a schoolgirl. Thou shalt wear blouse sleeves, black shoes, do all that. Wonderful, wonderful thing, which I just adore finding. Thou shalt be remembered, thou shalt not speak to thy sisters at thy school's corridors, for thou knowest the severe punishment the great benefactor has imposed upon thee, and so on. Further, at the co-educational Newcastle Teachers College, which opened in the late 40s in Newcastle, one woman recalls that the girls from Newcastle Girls High were called what? Does anybody know where they went? They went to the nunnery. Oh, the boys, the young men at the Teachers College regarded the girls from Newcastle Girls High as some of the nunnery. The girls' school was a secular place, apparently, a nunnery. The students were the neophytes initiated into the different alien style of womanhood, which was based on bodily restraint and professional power. All this is not to say that the general opinion of the teachers wasn't very favourable. The women recalled that they loved their teachers, they were glad to be educated by them, and Anne said she never felt limited by the fact that there were no men in the school. Theobald and Bilkin have pointed out the inadequacy of the grand romance of teaching for women, and that the heroic trope will no longer do for understanding women's teachers' lives, but tell that to their students. Yet these ideas of the heroic spinster professionals foregoing their natural destinies for the love of their work were active within the living memories of female students. On the other hand, the men gave a very different view of their teachers, not as otherworldly, but as ordinary men, not out of, but of the world. The men teachers, notice they're not wearing their gowns. They don't have to demonstrate their power. They're men. Okay. The men displayed a diversity of opinions when recalling their teachers at Newcastle Boys High. And this was because the men were more likely to view their teachers as everyday people. There was less psychic or interpersonal distance between the male staff and their students. This tendency to idolise them in any way. Male teachers did not have to give up normality in order to teach. They did not have to enter the unmarried cloister. They were not untouchable, they were worldly. Next slide. The men also knew at the time of their schooling a great amount of information about their teachers. For example, they knew their teachers' first names. They knew personal details such as whether they drank alcohol, whether they smoked tobacco, whether they enjoyed gambling on the horses, with how many children they had. The men sometimes also knew their teachers' political affiliations and acted on that knowledge. One mathematics teacher was known communist, and the boys used to hide his bike as a way of proving that they didn't agree with communism. Reg recalled that everybody knew he wore a red tie every day, but he was a good guy. As already mentioned, the men also talked more about control and discipline when recalling their teachers. The diversity of the memories indicated that the men's memories of male teachers were less likely to be romantic. Some remembered that their teachers were good at their job and good fellows. Collins said that his teachers were first class. Most of the teachers who taught me went on to become headmasters of schools in other parts, as indeed Collins did himself. On those days, you couldn't be a headmaster unless you were good at your job. They were bonds on that. Cyril said, I had good teachers, good fellows. Others gave an equivocal opinion. Gordon said in high school you had 7 or 8 different teachers. Some of them liked you liked, some of them you didn't like. Some of them. Colin just couldn't gel with his Latin teacher. Collins. He used to sit up there chewing cashews. If he ran out of cashews, he'd say, "Sit down to the shop, whoever was in the front row, get me a packet of cashews." And, you know, I'd sit there eating cashews all the time, and I used to think to myself, I hope it makes you sick. The men were more willing. We go to the next one. Yes, there it is, there, the cashews. The men were more willing than the women to challenge and judge their teachers negatively. For example, Wald thought his English teacher was a bit of a pig. Gary said that the man he had for English for 3 out of his 4 years at Newcastle Boys High School detested me before I detested him. Bob in particular, who was in the school in the 1950s, was scathing about the teachers as a group. Here it is. "I mean," he said, "I was staggered right from the beginning. In the supposedly best high school in Newcastle, we had all these drunks. We had all these refugees from the war. It was general opinion among the kids in the playground. Half the staff were communists, 2/3 of them were drunks, and most of them are not worth a pinch of the proverbial. And I would say I had not one decent teacher for the whole 5 years." Now, Bob and Gary, as we'll hear, are in the much later period of the 1950s. And this is what I'm saying, that this might indicate there was a change going on even in the boys' school with regard to how they viewed their teachers, perhaps very judgmental. Gary said he was educated at Newcastle Boys High in the late 1950s as well, said, "I only had one teacher for whom I had any regard, but the others were hopeless, not worth a cracker." The memories of Bob and Gary, the youngest of the men, suggest that there may have been some changes. Next one. We're almost there. At the boys' school, one of the French teachers seemed to polarise opinions. He was either very well liked or thought a hopeless case. Eric thought his teacher, whose nickname was Goofy, an absolutely splendid teacher. He was a bit of a buffoon. He was a very complicated man and apparently a groggeron, I think. Groggeron. By my standards, he was an absolutely superb teacher. And not in the way you could put your finger on, because I could write you a page of special vocab that I can remember from the lesson he taught us in. Apparently he used to teach swear words in French. So you could go into the corridors to the non-French speakers and abuse them, which was terrific. Okay. He hated bureaucracy in the system. He loved to tell you tales out of school, often rather naughty tales actually, but it was a boys' school and he could do that. On the other hand, Bob thought that this teacher was not very effective. He recalled in particular the teacher's cigarette smoking in the classroom and how he sometimes set the garbage tin on fire. And on one occasion emptied its contents out the second story. The male informants recalled their teachers as a diverse group of people who modelled masculine bodily practices at the time. They were embodied in a way that the female teachers were not. Their bodies had needs, and their needs, for example, cashew nuts or a cigarette, could be met even in the classroom. The boys thus learned that adult males were empowered to seek bodily comfort and fulfillment, whereas at the girls' school, female teachers demonstrated a bodily regime based on denial, untouchability, self-discipline, and artifice in the form of self-beautification. Now, I didn't have time here to include some of the memories of the girls about how their female teachers looked. And this was a very important part. The men didn't mention what the men wore except for a red tie, in denoting a commoners. Sure, 5 things for denoting a commoners. But the women did remember beautiful clothes, makeup, jewellery, you know, all those wonderful things. In fact, they were looking at their teachers as if they were objects to learn from, to be an object themselves. Very interesting. So if we can go to the next slide, my conclusions. Woven from the women's and men's memories about their secondary schooling, the analysis showed that the informants agreed that their teachers' professional identities were bound up with their ability to impart knowledge and to control the classroom. Otherwise, narratives about teachers emerged within gendered frameworks of understanding and yielded up a series of gender-based binaries: unmarried, married, unknowable, knowable, object, subject, psychological discipline, physical discipline. These binaries supported the major traits of the secular nun and the worldly men. They also reflected the gender regimes of the schools. At the boys' school, the type of masculinity promoted in their teachers' disciplinary practices and in their personal behaviours were consonant with their students' future roles. Now, some of them were going off to be soldiers, and they were going to have to be disciplined physically to be soldiers and to have their bodies hit. I can't talk about sport at this stage, but in my thesis, there's a whole section about sport and the types of sports that boys play as opposed to girls. Contact sport was a very important way that men's bodies were hardened and disciplined for their role in the society as breadwinners and soldiers, generally. Male teachers were knowable as people and displayed a wide range of social behaviours. They were at home in the world. At the girls' school, unmarried professional women teachers were remotely dedicated. The fact that they wielded uncustomary power created a dissonance between their feminine identity, supposed to be powerless and weak, and the fact that they ruled the school. And that dissonance was reflected in the students' memories. And I've suggested that the secular nun fits into that construction. It remains to ask what influence, if any, do these narrative constructions of teachers in the past, in the living memory of my respondents, hold in the present? Do they have any resonance at all? Are female teachers more likely than male teachers to be expected to perform their roles within a spiritual discourse of service and sacrifice? Are male teachers able to draw on a wider vocabulary of social behaviours in their teaching roles? Is the educational leadership of women still other and that of men normalised? And I'm, thinking about as the university bottom here when I was, that men ruled generally in the university. This small study suggests reasons why affirmative answers can be given to each of these questions. The past is not another country. That famous line, past is another country. It's not. The past lives in memory. And it lives in buildings as well. And of course, these promote shared understandings about the past, or mythologies, as I call them. These big mythologies. And we need more multifaceted studies of students' memories of teachers, not only to know their contribution to the historical construction of teacher identities, but also to map the possibilities and constraints for teachers and pedagogic practice into the future. So I'm happy to take questions or observations. I stunned myself earlier on the back door. Okay. Yeah, John.
I'm convinced you told the whole truth. It's a wonderful paper.
Thank you.
I was thinking when I was at Manly West Public School in 6th class, I used to sit near the big windows, and there was that time of the year when mothers, sometimes fathers, mainly mothers, came to see the principal and find out where we would be sent.
Yes.
Because there were two places. There was a selected high school, fairly new one, Manly Boys High and Curl, and there was Balgowlah, which was a comprehensive high school. So I was entertained and disturbed, perhaps, as I saw the women coming in, and there were 60 of us in the class.
60.
About 8 were chosen to go to Manly Boys High, and the others to St. Paul's
The
Boys High. But as the women left one by one, some were sobbing, going through the rose garden, sobbing and up the stairs and then there are other happy little
It
mothers
was a big deal.
striding. And it was the first impression I had of how important the community gave to a selected school.
And still do.
Yes. And of course, Manly was behind because it had no full high school for a long time. Newcastle got it much earlier.
Much earlier, yeah.
And they had an intermediate high for boys, and I'm not sure about girls. They had a home science school for girls, and all in the one place in Manly. It was primary school, the intermediate high school for girls, and home science school. And it's lost the plot, I think. Because we had an independent member of the state parliament, he was in power for about 27 years. So neither Labour nor Liberal supported the idea of the school.
Yeah.
And anyway, those that finished,
It's getting up.
finished the intermediate would go to Sydney Boys High
Yeah,
or the senior
the top school
and later on
and fourth school.
North Sydney Boys High. So this is coming back to what I was trying.
Pride women.
It was very, very
Yeah.
important.
And of course, most of the people here that I interviewed actually did what was called the primary final. And the primary final ended in the 1930s, but the primary final was like a sieve for children. And you sat the primary final. If you got the requisite marks, you went off to the selective school, and then they funneled them into other ways. It was sorting and selecting. Sorting and selecting. What for, though? For later, for the society. Who would be the aristocracy or talent, and who would be the worker bees? This was quite a, education as quite a deliberative process, social process, in order to channel people into futures. And I'm an enabling educator, and I worked in the Open Foundation, and I know how wrong the sorting often could be, and how different rates of maturity meant that people could be brilliant and not be picked up in primary school as brilliant, not be picked up even in high school, but spend some time in the society and then go, wait a minute, I understand a whole lot more than they said I did. Maybe I have. And of course, they only ever looked at certain types of talent rather than the numbers of intelligences we now know exist. There aren't just intellectual intelligences. No. Yeah. So, other observations or questions?
Both these schools strictly selective, or was there kind of
brothers?
Yes.
Family networks.
Yeah, because
yeah, they were pretty selective. Yeah, but some it's got in. Of course, their teachers break grief because they didn't get the principles that they were being taught straight away. They probably got keys and that knocked on their head or peanuts thrown at them or something. Yeah.
I'm just kind of interested whether there was both of those schools developed a bit of an aristocracy in Newcastle.
Oh, they did.
Yeah.
And within New South Wales and within Australia. While they existed, these schools contributed mightily to a meritocracy that was developing in the colonies and in the state in New South Wales and in Australia. So judges, physicians, teachers, headmistresses and headmasters galore you know, high-level teaching, departmental officers, public servants, not many politicians, I don't think, Newcastle Girls High, Newcastle Boys High. I don't recall.
Virginia Chadwick. but
Virginia
she's
Chadwick,
been
Newcastle Girls High, a bit later.
Yeah.
Of course, Kevin Gosper. I mean, there's, yes, they created, in fact, Boys High, I think was about, and I'm going to say 8, but I could be wrong. They were the 8th producer of Who's Who entries out of the selective schools in New South Wales. So they produced a lot of talented and high-profile men, and of course, Pat and Borry is a famous example of Newcastle Boys High School in national, international psychiatrist, and he went to Newcastle Boys High, like him. Yeah. Who had a secular nun for a teacher? Anybody?
There were married teachers. I went 1961.
You're all too young.
I started at Girls High. There were quite a few married teachers.
Yeah.
I was thinking when you were saying the boys complaining about the teachers in the 50s at Boys High.
Yeah.
I suppose a lot of men were killed in the war, so they might have had to, you know, trawl from a wider group to get the teachers.
And of course, the teachers themselves who'd stayed on were aging. So I think the aging of the workforce, the teaching workforce at that time, who may have started at the schools in the 1930s and 40s, by the 1950s, they're starting not to look so glossy and, you know, not be able to run in the athletics carnival or teach football properly or, you know, so they were being judged pretty harshly. But other things were happening at Boys High too in that period. Aside from the old soldiers, and there were old soldiers on the staff who used to, they knew that with one particular teacher, they could distract him by saying, "What did you do in the war, sir?" And off he would go. And for 40 minutes, he would regale about Posiers and, you know, whatever, this old World War I veteran. So,
I think in a way that is an interesting aspect. I had a teacher called Pennywood Ross, and we could distract him to talk about the Antarctic
yes.
because he was a geologist from one of the expeditions. I thought we called him Pennywood, but that's not true because I was going through the Mitchell Library display there, and it had all of his equipment on display from the Antarctic expedition, and the knives and forks were engraved.
Penguin. That was his name.
He made science memorable. And the next teacher I had didn't. He was a disciplinarian.
Yeah.
And he failed in his degree.
Yes. And some of the teachers at the girls' school would be like, "Oh, you only got 89. What happened to you? You know, you only got 92. Was it a bad day?" You know, this kind of stuff has well, if the boys were, you know, you should have gotten 95. What's the problem with you? Yes. So it was a very different regime. Well, that's what came through in the memories. Yes. And this is a memorial discussion about memory itself. And we remember strange things, don't we, about our schooling? It's what is meaningful for us. But what is interesting to me is how people sing together. You know, how they can use the same words. And these are women who didn't attend the Girls' High reunions. Some of them didn't. And so, but they were still saying these things. So the opportunities for rehearsal weren't there. As you know, when you all get together and go, "Oh, you remember old so-and-so," you know, and you kind of rehearse your memory. Quite a few of these women hadn't rehearsed with anyone, hadn't talked about this schooling, but said the same sort of things.
How did you choose the people you interviewed?
They chose me. I was in a project. How it came about, because my mother went to Newcastle Girls High My husband went to Newcastle Boys High. My cousins went to Newcastle Boys High. My cousins went to Newcastle Girls High. So I have been hearing stories about these schools for yonks. And I was involved in a project with Alison Holbrook at the university, Professor Holbrook now. And she was doing a thing called Youth at School and Work in Huntington. And I was an interviewer on her project. She invited me to do a PhD with her. I said yes. I was a mature age student. I said yes, I would love to do a PhD. And I thought, well, what can I do? I love local history. I wanted to do something that was within the project because I was reading up on education in New South Wales. And so I was part of this project, and it had advertised through old people's homes all around the place anyway, in newspapers for interviewees. And when I got my project approved through ethics, I also advertised, and I got 24 women and 16 men replied, and I interviewed them in their homes. So that's self-selected, and which skews the data. I mean, this is not a definitive study in that I'm saying hundreds of students who went to Newcastle Girls High. These are self-selected people. People who select in often are happy to talk. They are interested in talking about their school life. Often they've got favourable memories. So that can skew the data. But I was lucky enough to get quite a few people who, because they were trained intellectually at their high schools, knew that knowledge is a various thing, and that they were quite willing to look at diverse memories that they had, not just, they didn't just tell me the good story. And of course, these interviews lasted 1.5 to 2 hours and often ended in tears. In oral history interviews, I don't know if any of you have done any, but if you have, you know that memory is a delicate flower, and the interviewer has to be sensitive to what's going on, because sometimes things we remember are not happy. We remember the passing of people that we love. We remember, it's all about endings, isn't it? You're talking about when I was at school. So it can be quite a poignant exercise for both the interviewer and especially for the interviewee. So it's a very interesting thing, oral history interviewing.
Can you tell us the one teacher that got a bit closer to the girls?
Yes, she was very young. As you would imagine, she had not been disciplined. She was a French teacher, I believe. She was beautifully dressed. She had short hair. She didn't have her hair grey, bummed, nothing like that. And she would talk to the girls. And they felt like she was somebody I could be like that. Okay. That feels like an end, is it? No more questions?
Just one observation.
Yeah, please.
It's very difficult, isn't it, to have one perfect system? Some people would argue now that there's teachers are too close to their students.
Exactly.
If you have a look at Chris Dawson, for example.
Now that is an interesting story, because I think that's what starts to happen in the 1950s.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And so we're trying to create this perfect system, but we just, I think in education, it goes round and round in circles, and after a while we go to do the same thing.
Yeah, and that's happening right now with teaching of reading and many other things.
So it's very difficult to sort of get what's perfect. And all these people have different memories. Some people who we would think very bad teachers because of strength and the other screen, and other people thought fantastic.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's right. It is education. It's kind of an ancient art, actually. And it's at its best, it's controlled conversation at its best, as long as the students aren't too mouthy.
But I think university is a great example of that too, because we're trying to be controlled by people,
Yes,
and that's what's coming down.
it's coming down. Oh, totally, totally, completely agree. Mm, mm. You've been a delightful audience. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
It's
It's been
great.
great.
Thank you so much, Joe. That was such an interesting presentation.